Hey, did you know that there is a medieval castle for sale? Sure, it might not be in your budget with its asking price of $3 million, but hey, a guy can dream, right? If you happen to have a spare $3 million laying around and you're interested in this particular castle, I would advise you to look elsewhere. That's because this particular castle was actually used as a prison for over 800 years. So, if you're looking for a vacation home, or maybe somewhere to retire, perhaps this isn't the best choice. You'd probably want something a bit more cheery than a former prison. But why were these castles used as prisons? After all, they were meant to be fortresses and seats of power, right? Well, some castles were also used as prisons, which we'll get into later. But let's start with the assumption that you might want to buy a castle because you love medieval architecture, or maybe you're a huge Lord of the Rings fan. Well, in either case, you should be aware that most castles weren't palaces at all, but rather fortresses designed to house soldiers and store weapons and supplies. Take, for example, Caerphilly Castle, which is considered to be one of the largest castles in Wales. It was built in the 13th century and served as a stronghold for the English during their conquest of Wales. Caerphilly Castle wasn't designed to be a luxury residence. In fact, most castles didn't have indoor plumbing, proper ventilation, or even enough furniture for everyone who lived there. Keep in mind that when you imagine a medieval castle, you might picture a place where royalty lived in luxury, but the reality was much different. Castles were usually pretty cramped and unsanitary places. The rooms were small and dark, and the lack of proper ventilation meant that waste would often pile up in the corners. To make matters worse, there was usually only one bathroom for everyone to share, and since there was no toilet paper, people would use whatever they had handy to clean themselves after using the throne. Sometimes, people would share a room with livestock, making the living conditions even more unsanitary. But it gets worse. Castles were often attacked and sieged, which meant that the residents had to constantly be on the lookout for invaders. If a castle was attacked, everyone inside would have to scramble to defend it. This meant that there was always a sense of danger and uncertainty hanging over the residents of castles. Not exactly what you want in a home. And that's just the beginning. Castles were also expensive to maintain. If you've ever been to one, you'll know that they require a lot of upkeep. The walls and towers need to be constantly repaired, and the drawbridge and other defensive structures need to be regularly serviced. All of this requires a lot of money, and it's one of the reasons why so many castles fell into disrepair. Over time, the cost of maintaining a castle became too much for the owners to bear, and many of them were abandoned. So unless you're planning on living in a cardboard box, you'll probably want to skip the castle. But that's not even the worst part. Castles were also notoriously difficult to escape from. The thick stone walls and high towers made it almost impossible to sneak out, and if you were caught trying to escape, you would likely be put to death. There were some instances of people successfully escaping from castles, but these were rare. Most people who tried to escape were caught and executed. Now, you might be thinking that surely life couldn't have been that bad in a castle. After all, some people probably enjoyed living there. And you'd be right. Life in a castle wasn't all bad. Some castles were actually quite comfortable, and the residents enjoyed the luxury of living in a grand residence. But overall, the negative aspects of castle life far outweighed the positives. Castles were often cramped, dirty, and dangerous places to live, and they required a lot of money to maintain. Plus, if you were ever caught trying to escape, you'd probably be put to death. So, if you're thinking about buying a castle, you might want to reconsider. In addition to the problems mentioned above, castles were also prone to being attacked by animals. Large animals like bears and wolves could easily scale the castle walls and then prey on the livestock or even the humans inside. Castles were also susceptible to smaller animals like rats and mice, which could cause disease and spread filth. Then there were the insects like fleas and ticks, which carried diseases that could kill entire populations of people. Not exactly what you'd call a health resort. Another problem with castles was that they were often isolated. They were built for defense, so they were usually located away from other settlements. This meant that the residents had to travel long distances to get supplies or to visit friends and family. This could be dangerous, especially if you were traveling alone. There was always the risk of being attacked by bandits or wild animals. All of this is to say that castles were not the luxurious homes that they are often portrayed as in movies and TV shows. They were often dirty, dangerous, and isolated places to live. So, if you're thinking about buying one, you might want to think again. But let's return to the original question. Why were some castles used as prisons? Well, there are a few reasons. First of all, castles were often used as prisons because they were easy to defend. A castle's thick walls and high towers made it difficult for prisoners to escape. Additionally, the remote location of many castles made it unlikely that anyone would come to rescue the prisoners. Another reason why castles were used as prisons is that they were seen as a way to punish prisoners. The harsh living conditions inside a castle were a form of punishment in and of themselves. In addition, prisoners were often forced to do hard labor, such as repairing the castle walls or cooking meals for the guards. This was another way that castles were used to punish prisoners. Finally, castles were used as prisons because they were available. In many cases, the government or nobility would take over an existing castle and use it as a prison. This was especially common after a castle had been used for military purposes and was no longer needed as a stronghold. So basically, when the military was done with a castle, it was turned into a prison. One of the most famous examples of a castle being used as a prison is the Tower of London. The Tower of London was originally built in the 11th century as a royal palace and fortress, but it was also used as a prison for much of its history. Some of the most famous prisoners of the Tower of London include Sir Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and Guy Fawkes. In addition to being used as a prison, the Tower of London was also used as a torture chamber and execution ground. So, it's safe to say that the Tower of London was one of the most feared places in England. Another famous example of a castle being used as a prison is Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. Edinburgh Castle was used as a prison for over 700 years, from the 14th to the 20th century. The castle's dark and dank cells were a horrible place to be imprisoned, and many people died while incarcerated there. So, if you're in Edinburgh, you might want to avoid the castle. Of course, not all castles were used as prisons. Many of them served as the homes of kings and queens, while others were used as barracks for soldiers or storage for weapons and supplies. However, The examples of castles being used as prisons show that these structures were not always the luxurious residences that they are today. Sometimes they were dark, dank, and dangerous places to be imprisoned. If you want to learn more about medieval history, check out the series in the description below. With that said, thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.